685 pushed central Scotland out of the English sphere. In the 12th century it seemed as though the northern counties of England would be absorbed by Scotland, when David I intervened in support of his niece Matilda, who claimed the English crown after the death of Henry I. 1136 he marched into England and occupied a string of castles, including Carlisle, Alnwick and Newcastle. Land hunger overcame family loyalty, however, and he made peace with Matilda's foe, King Stephen, in exchange for keeping Carlisle, which, despite reneging and then suffering a stinging defeat at the Battle of the Standard 2 years later, the Scots retained until 1154. Then, ever eager to make capital out of English dynastic squabbles, Alexander II invaded England in 1215 in support of Louis of France's attempt to overthrow King John, having been invited in by baronial malcontents, leading his army all the way to Dover. The death of John, paradoxically, thwarted him, for the English barons then united behind his young successor, Henry III. When Louis came to terms with the new king, Alexander was left isolated and had to evacuate the northern English counties, which he had occupied. In 1237 he negotiated the Treaty of York with Henry, which set the border much along its modern course, with the exception of a 16-kilometre or 10-mile by 6.5-kilometre 4-mile tract in the west between the rivers Sark and Esk. Although relations between England veered in the following centuries between poor and downright hostile, with the invasions launched by Edward I of England from 1296 marking but a low point, exactly what constituted England and what made up Scotland was largely not in dispute, except that is in the case of those debatable lands in the west. Here, on both sides of the permeable border, families of border reivers flourished, raiding at will on the other side and occasionally providing martial support to their theoretical sovereigns, as when a large contingent of Scottish reivers fought at Flodden in 1513. Largely, though, the reivers were the source of intense irritation to the authorities, who resented the depredations of families such as the Armstrongs on the Scottish side and the Grahams on the English. In 1530, James V of Scotland took decisive action and had Johnny Armstrong of Kilknocky and 31 leading reivers hanged, while in 1531 the English and Scottish authorities declared that all Englishmen and Scottish men, after this proclamation made, are and shall be free to rob, burn, spoil, slay, murder, and destroy all and every such persons, their bodies, buildings, goods, and cattle, as to remain or shall inhabit upon any part of the said debatable land, without any redress to be made for the same. Finally, in 1552, a commission was established to settle the border once and for all, and it was hoped to reduce the border reivers' freedom of action. Sadly, the raiding continued, and it took a renewed effort under James VI of Scotland when he ascended to the English throne as James I in 1603 to impose relative peace on what he now called the Middle Shires. New courts were established to try offenders, and given that reivers could not now evade justice for offences on one side of the border by fleeing to the other, the level of their activities subsided. If not exactly peaceful, the borderlands were no longer debatable. Interesting. Never knew that. succession divorced one wife, Catherine of Aragon, beheaded another, Anne Boleyn, and seen a third, Jane Seymour, die in childbirth in October 1537. Almost precisely a year earlier, the Pilgrimage of Grace, a religiously inspired uprising in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, had come perilously close to unseating him from the throne, as devotees wearing the badge of the Bleeding Heart of Christ had gathered under the leadership of a charismatic lawyer, Robert Aske. Before long, 40,000 men were following his banners, demanding the removal of heretical bishops such as Cranmer and the restoration of the old Catholic faith. Only the false promise of a pardon delivered by the respected Duke of Norfolk diffused the momentum of the revolt and allowed Henry's men to arrest, ask and hang over 200 of the rebels, stamping out the spark of dissent in the north. Henry was aging, corpulent, and suffered persistent ulcers on his leg, a far cry from his self-image as a chivalric paladin, best riding the battlefields of Europe. His 20-year rivalry with Francis I of France seemed to have been resolved in favour of his rival, who had begun building a lavish chateau at Chambord in 1519. Determined not to be outdone, Henry threw himself into a frenzied campaign of building, most notably in 1531-6 at Hampton Court, the former home of the disgraced Cardinal Wolsey. In 1538, Henry turned to another project. He needed a hunting lodge close to London in which he could travel without a long journey on horseback, which his ill health now made a tiring prospect. His eyes soon lit on the manor owned by the Coddington family near Cheam in Surrey. The Coddingtons were made a peremptory offer for their lands, and building began almost immediately. The church of Coddington was demolished to make way for the new palace's inner court, whose splendour soon became so apparent it was named Nonsuch, a way of claiming that it had no equal in Europe. No mistress of Charles II, to whom the king had gifted it. An inveterate gambler, Lady Castlemaine ran up staggering debts, once reputedly losing £25,000 in a single night at cards, and could not afford to keep the palace up. A monument to the folly of one king's attention to his mistresses, it was brought low by the mistress of another. Interesting. Now, here we have a copper plate map of London. It's quite difficult to see actually. It's very detailed, but a little bit faint. And actually what's interesting is that some of the road names are backwards. So that should read Cornwell, and it's actually backwards, so I don't know whether that's a mistake, but let's read it and find out what this one's about. It is the earliest surviving true map as opposed to panorama of London. This 1558 copper plate engraving formed the basis of plans of London for the next half century. It shows a city etched in reverse. Okay, so it was supposed to be in reverse. Whose 100,000 people were parked into an area of only around a couple of square kilometres, 1 square mile, with teeming alleys and labyrinthine lanes, only occasionally punctuated by the spire of one of London's many churches. London Bridge can be seen at the bottom of the plate. Yeah, down here. There's the Thames. The plates, of which only 3 of the original 15 survive, while no printed version of the map now exists. Oh, so this is a plate which is white in reverse. Were probably made late in the reign of Mary Tudor by German merchants who were lobbying her husband, Philip II of Spain, to maintain their privileges in London. Its date is indicated by the absence of the Royal Exchange, only opened in 1571, and the sighting of a cross in the churchyard of St. Botolph without Bishopsgate, which was destroyed in an anti-Catholic riot a few months after the accession of Elizabeth I in 1558. Marriage and Catholicism. These were the 2 themes which dominated the life of Mary, Henry VIII's eldest surviving child. Her birth in 1516 had been a bitter disappointment to the king after the death of 2 sons who had only survived a few weeks. Although she was cherished and received an excellent education, learning to speak and read French, Spanish and Latin, the lack of a male heir bothered Henry, and Mary became the subject of protracted negotiations in which her hand in marriage was variously promised to the French Dauphin, Emperor Charles V and Duke Philip of Bavaria. As a result of the annulment of Henry's marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, Mary was declared illegitimate in 1533 and lived a shadow life in exile from the court. Only in 1537, when the king's 3rd wife gave birth to a son, the future Edward VI, thus rendering both Mary and her younger sister Elizabeth irrelevant to the dynastic succession, was she welcomed back into the royal fold. When the old king finally died in 1547, Mary was forced into a delicate balancing act, keeping true to her Catholic faith while trying to distance herself, but not too obviously, from the increasingly radical Protestantism of Edward VI advisors, larger settlement. Mary's reign ended in dissolution. Public opinion had turned against her, and her memory will be damned by the lurid accounts of the burnings published in George Fox's Book of Martyrs, published shortly after her death. The marriage with Philip II yielded no heirs and led to England becoming embroiled in a war with France and the resultant loss of Calais, the last English outpost on French soil, in January 1558. It was said unkindly that when she died, an isolated, embittered woman, on the 17th of November that year, that Calais would be found engraved upon her heart. Okay, so let's go a little bit further. That's a very colourful map. Cambridge Town Plan. County map of Cornwall. And that's it in all its glory. So that's a strange map. That's map of Elizabeth I's Norfolk progress. A beacon map of Kent. Let's read about this. Now it says that the bigger map is on this side, so here it is. This is the full map. And we can see the beacons at certain points. That says part of Sussex. Beacons of Kent. Let's read about this then. Lines radiate out in all directions from the principal town and villages of Kent in this 1585 map by William Lambard. Yet they are not distant indicators nor aids to route finding, but sight lines for the network of warning beacons which dotted the county, waiting to be lit at the moment the watchers who manned them caught sight of an enemy. The notion of communication beacons was an ancient one, the light of their fires travelling faster than any messenger could possibly do. The first definite mention of them in England comes from the Isle of Wight in 1324, where 31 beacons were recorded as being in use to guard the island against attack. In Kent, a royal order was sent in 1326 referring to the said watch, who watch have a sign of fire, or of other effective means which can be seen from afar, so that the men of the neighbouring parts may be able to betake themselves to the fire or other signal in the night. As ever, it was fear of invasion from the continent and principally from France that motivated the retention and maintenance of the beacon and network, a task which was all too often neglected in times of peace. In 1539, Henry VIII's minister, Thomas Cromwell, was forced to issue an order that the beacons were to be renewed at a time when tensions with France were once again rising. In 1546, more detailed instructions were issued. Each station was to have 3 beacon fires, which were all to be lit on sight of a full invasion force, but only one in the event of a lesser incursion. The system was on occasion misused Scots in Sussex, who had fired the beacon warning of a full invasion that never materialised. To resolve this, it was determined that only when 10 hostile French ships were definitely sighted and had begun to offload troops should the beacons be lit. When Lambert's map was issued in 1585, he was forced to rebut suggestions that publishing the beacon map was actually aiding the enemy, pointing out that the merits of alerting the county militia to an invasion far outweighed the advantages to the invaders in knowing they had been seen. That enemy by now was Philip II of Spain, angered by Elizabeth I's restoration of Protestantism, followed the death of her sister Mary, who had been Philip's wife, and by her support for Dutch rebels against Spanish domination in the Netherlands. The beacon's greatest test came in 1588, when Philip II dispatched his Great Armada up the English Channel to rendezvous with an invasion force waiting on the Dutch coast under the Duke of Parma. The Armada's progress was slow. It took a week to reach Calais, where it was comprehensively defeated by the English fleet under Lord Howard of Effingham and Sir Francis Drake, and so the guardians of the beacons should have had ample time to light their fires. Yet there are no reports that they did so in Kent, and only one from Portsmouth. At England's time of greatest trial, its beacons proved to be a damp squib. Nonetheless, the beacon network was retained, and an order to upgrade it came in 1596 after the Earls of Essex and Nottingham attacked Cadiz, ransacking the Spanish port, extracting a fee of 120,000 ducats to evacuate it, and taking a clutch of hostages for further ransom. Retaliation was feared, though it never came. The beacons were still being manned in 1640, but by 1672 had fallen into disuse as a scheme was proposed to revive them, perhaps as a result of one of Britain's greatest naval disasters, when a Dutch fleet crept unseen up the Medway in June 1667 and attacked the British fleet at anchor in Chatham, burning 13 ships and capturing 2, including, humiliatingly, the flagship, the Royal Charles. The beacon's long duty as a warning of war was over, however, and they became a symbol of nostalgia for the glorious past of the Elizabethan era, finding their most recent use during the Diamond Jubilee of the second Queen Elizabeth. In 2012, when thousands were lit across the country to mark the 60th anniversary of her accession, I remember that. No, not when she was originally, when her original coronation was, but I remember the Diamond Jubilee and all the beacons being lit. And there it is again. That's quite a lot of beacons. Some of them are quite close together. I guess it depends on the terrain. Now this is a map of the Spanish Armada. Here, so British Isles. There's the Isle of Man, Ireland, England, Wales, Scotland. So this map is by Robert Adams. A thin line looping around the east coast of England and the west coasts of Scotland and Ireland in this 1588 map by Robert Adams satellite and panic spread among Medina Sidonia's captains. They surged out of their safety of Calais harbour straight into Howard's waiting formation. 5 sank or foundered almost immediately. The rest found their way, blocked by the English fleet and impeded by winds which left their only avenue of escape northwards into the North Sea. So the Spanish fled and continued to flee. Medina Sidonia paused only to throw surplus horses overboard and to hang the captain of the Santa Barbara for cowardice. Howard followed them all the way to the Firth of Forth, until on the 12th of August it was clear that they no longer posed any threat, and he broke off the pursuit. For the Spanish, though, the agony was not yet over. Medina Sidonia ignored the advice of senior captains that, given the Armada had no accurate charts of the coast of Scotland and Ireland, having expected never to need them, you should give these a wide berth. Storms and navigational errors led to dozens of Spanish ships sinking or running aground. Many of the survivors were some